My mom sold off my dad's legacy to spoil her stepson, but when I came back with my old friend, her carefully crafted life fell apart. I used to think that mothers were supposed to protect their children's most precious memories, until I discovered mine had sold every last piece of my father's legacy to fund her stepson's shopping sprees. My name is Isabel Carter, and I'm 27 years old. I teach English literature at Jefferson High School, where I spend my days helping teenagers understand the beauty of words and stories. 2 weeks ago, I buried my father after a brutal 6-month battle with lung cancer. He was my anchor, my confidant, the one person who truly understood my love for books and quiet Sunday mornings spent discussing everything from Shakespeare to the morning news over coffee and toast. The cancer had been eating away at Dad for 8 long months, and I'd watched him shrink from the strong, vibrant man who used to fix everything in our house to someone who needed help just getting to the bathroom. Despite all those months of preparing for the inevitable, witnessing his gradual decline day by day, nothing could have readied me for the hollow ache that settled in my chest the moment his heart stopped beating. What struck me as odd, though, was how composed Mom appeared throughout the entire ordeal. While I was falling apart, she maintained this almost unsettling sense of calm and control. Linda Carter had always been practical, even cold at times, but this felt different. At 53, she'd built a reputation as the most efficient receptionist at Dr. Morrison's private clinic downtown, where she'd worked for nearly a decade. Her colleagues often praised her ability to handle difficult patients and complicated scheduling without ever losing her composure. But watching her navigate Dad's death with the same detached professionalism she used at work made my skin crawl. 3 years earlier, she'd married Robert Henderson, a soft-spoken insurance adjuster who seemed decent enough, though he'd never quite figured out how to connect with me. Robert came as a package deal with his 16-year-old son Marcus, a quiet kid who spent most of his time gaming and seemed uncomfortable with the whole blended family situation. I genuinely tried to embrace this new arrangement, telling myself that Dad deserved happiness and that Mom had every right to build a new life. But from the moment they moved in together, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd become secondary in my own family. Mom's attention, her energy, her resources, everything seemed to flow toward Robert and Marcus, while I got the leftover scraps of affection and consideration. We kept the funeral intimate, just the way Dad would have wanted it. Maybe 40 people gathered in the chapel he attended since childhood, sunlight filtering through stained glass windows that had witnessed 3 generations of our family's most important moments. His longtime friends took turns at the podium, their voices thick with emotion as they painted vivid pictures of the man I'd loved so deeply. Old Mr. Peterson from the stamp collecting club spoke about Dad's encyclopedic knowledge of postal history and how he could identify rare specimens just by touch. Mrs. Chen, his reading group companion for over 2 decades, described his excitement whenever he discovered a signed first edition at estate sales, always calling her immediately to share the find. His former engineering colleague, Jim, told everyone about the antique pocket watch Dad carried everywhere, a family heirloom passed down from his own father, who'd carried it through World War II. As I listened to these stories, I realized these friends understood something that apparently Mom had forgotten. Dad's collections weren't about monetary worth or showing off. Each stamp represented a country he'd dreamed of visiting. Every signed book was a conversation he'd treasured with a writer whose work moved him, and that pocket watch wasn't just timekeeper. It was a connection to the grandfather I'd never met but felt I knew through Dad's stories. Izzy, he used to say during our Sunday afternoon treasure hunts through antique shops, these things aren't valuable because of money, they're valuable because they hold stories, and stories are what make us human. After the service, I expected we'd spend time going through his belongings together, maybe sharing memories over each item. Instead, Mom seemed eager to get everyone out of the house. "We need time to process," she kept saying, ushering people away with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. When I suggested staying the night in my old room, she quickly dismissed the idea. "You need your own space to grieve properly, honey. Besides, Robert and Marcus need quiet too." Something felt off, but grief has a way of clouding judgment. I attributed her behavior to her own way of coping with loss. Maybe she needed to process everything alone before she could face the emotional weight of Dad's belongings. I convinced myself to give her time and space, to be the understanding daughter she needed during this difficult period. But over the next few days, her avoidance became impossible to ignore. Every time I called to check on her or offered to help with anything, she had an excuse. She was too tired, or Robert was handling things, or Marcus needed attention with his schoolwork. When I drove by the house, I noticed she'd drawn all the curtains shut, as if she was hiding from the world, or from me. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I'd been having a particularly rough day at school, missing Dad terribly, when I decided to stop by the house unannounced. I needed to feel close to him, to maybe sit in his study for a few minutes and remember what it felt like when he was still here to offer comfort and wisdom. I used my old key, the one I'd had since high school, and stepped into the house that had been my childhood home. The silence felt different somehow, not peaceful but hollow. I made my way upstairs to Dad's study, my heart pounding with anticipation and grief. I pushed open the door expecting to see his mahogany desk covered with papers, his bookshelf lined with treasured volumes, his collection displays arranged just as he'd left them. Instead, I found nothing. The room was completely empty except for basic furniture. No books, no stamp collection, no pocket watch, no signed photographs, no awards from his 40 years as an engineer. Even the curtains were different. Cheap, generic ones that looked nothing like the rich burgundy drapes Dad had chosen because they reminded him of old libraries. My legs gave out and I sank into the single remaining chair, his desk chair thankfully still there. My hands shook as I opened the desk drawers, finding them completely bare. Not even a pencil remained. It was as if Dad's entire existence had been erased from the room where he'd spent countless hours reading, working, and dreaming. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to process what I was seeing. Maybe Mom had moved everything for safekeeping. Maybe she'd packed it all away because it was too painful to look at. There had to be a reasonable explanation for why everything was gone. When I heard the front door open, I practically ran downstairs. Mom stood in the entryway, her work badge still hanging around her neck, looking startled to see me. "Isabel, what are you doing here? Mom, where are Dad's things?" "His study is completely empty." Her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, guilt, defensiveness, before settling on a forced casualness that made my stomach turn. "Oh, those old things. I donated most of them and sold the rest. We needed the money for the funeral expenses, and honestly, honey, they were just collecting dust." The words hit me like a physical blow. Just collecting dust? Mom, those were his most precious possessions. The stamp collection alone was worth thousands, not to mention the sentimental value. And the books, some of those were first editions. "Isabel, you're being dramatic. They were just objects. Your father is gone, and we can't live in a museum to his memory. Robert and I need to move forward, and Marcus needs things for school. I got good money for everything, and it's being put to practical use." "Practical use? What exactly did you spend it on?" She straightened up, her defensive walls rising higher. "That's really not your concern. I'm his widow, and I made the decisions I thought were best for this family. You have your own life, your own apartment, your own job. We have expenses here that you don't understand." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Dad's face when he'd show me a new addition to his collection, or the way his eyes lit up when he found a book signed by an author he admired. Those items weren't just objects, they were pieces of his soul, carefully curated over decades of passion and dedication. I decided to do some investigating. It wasn't hard to figure out where she might have sold things. There were only a few reputable antique shops and collectible dealers in town. I started making calls, pretending to be interested in similar items, asking if they'd had any recent acquisitions. At the third shop I called, Miller's Antiques, the owner's voice perked up when I mentioned vintage stamps and signed books. "Oh yes, we had a lovely collection come in about 3 weeks ago. Beautiful condition, clearly well maintained." The woman who brought them in seemed eager to sell quickly. 3 weeks ago. Dad had still been alive 3 weeks ago, fighting for every breath in his hospital bed while Mom was secretly selling his treasures. My blood turned to ice. 3 weeks ago, are you sure? Absolutely. I remember because she came in twice, once with the books and stamps, and again a few days later with some jewelry and a gorgeous pocket watch. Sold everything well below market value because she said she needed cash immediately. I thanked him and hung up, my hands trembling with rage. Mom hadn't sold Dad's things to pay for funeral expenses. She'd sold them while he was dying, probably to fund whatever she deemed more important than preserving his legacy. I needed to know what had been so urgent that she'd betrayed Dad's trust while he lay helpless in a hospital bed. It didn't take long to find out. Marcus had been posting photos on social media throughout Dad's final weeks, pictures of a brand new laptop, expensive sneakers, designer clothes, even a gaming setup that must have cost thousands, all timestamped during the exact period when Mom was liquidating Dad's collection. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. While I was holding Dad's hand, reading to him from his favorite books, helping him eat when his appetite failed, and telling him stories to keep his spirits up, Mom was systematically dismantling everything he'd built and loved. She was funding her stepson's lifestyle with the pieces of my father's heart. When I confronted her the next day, she didn't even try to deny it. Marcus needed those things for school and to fit in with his friends. Your father would have understood. He was always generous. Generous with his permission, Mom. He would have given Marcus anything if you'd just asked, but you didn't ask because you knew he'd want those things to stay in the family, to be passed down to me. You're an adult, Isabel. You don't need old stamps and dusty books. Marcus is still growing, still developing. He deserves to have nice things, and Robert's salary can only stretch so far. I stared at her, finally seeing clearly the woman my father had spent 30 years loving. She wasn't grieving, she was liberated. Free to prioritize the family she'd chosen over preserving anything from the life she'd shared with Dad. That's when I remembered something Dad had mentioned during one of our last conversations. He'd been talking about his friend Harrison Webb, a lawyer he'd known for over 30 years. They'd served together in the National Guard and had maintained their friendship through decades of marriages, divorces, career changes, and life's ups and downs. Harrison's a good man, Dad had said, his voice weak but his eyes alert. If anything happens to me, and you ever need someone who knew me when I was young and stupid, call Harrison. He'll tell you stories about me that even your mother doesn't know. At the time, I'd thought it was just the rambling of a sick man missing his old friend. Now I realized it might have been something more deliberate. A message, maybe even a warning. I found Harrison Webb's law office listed in the phone directory. When I called, his secretary put me through immediately after I mentioned Dad's name. Isabel, my God, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was one of the finest men I've ever known. How are you holding up? His voice was warm and genuinely concerned, and for the first time in weeks I felt like someone understood the magnitude of what we'd lost. Mr. Webb, I'm not sure how to say this, but I think I need help. It's about Dad's belongings. Can you come to my office this afternoon? I think we need to have a conversation that's long overdue. Harrison Webb was exactly what I'd expected from Dad's description. Tall, silver-haired, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of quiet authority that comes from decades of helping people navigate life's worst moments. His office was lined with law books and military memorabilia, including a framed photo of him and Dad in their National Guard uniforms, both grinning and impossibly young. Your father was worried about this exact situation, he said after I'd explained what had happened. He came to see me about 6 months ago, right after his diagnosis. He wanted to make sure certain items would be protected. My heart stopped. Protected how? Harrison opened a file cabinet and withdrew a thick manila folder. He created a separate will, specifically for his personal collection and certain family heirlooms. Everything your mother sold. The stamps, the books, the pocket watch, even some jewelry that had belonged to his mother. All of it was designated specifically for you. I felt dizzy, but Mom said she was his widow, that she had the right to make those decisions. She had the right to make decisions about jointly owned property and assets acquired during their marriage. But these items were specifically excluded from their joint ownership. Your father had documentation proving he'd owned everything before their marriage, and he'd kept meticulous records. More importantly, he'd legally designated you as the sole inheritor of these specific items. So what Mom did was illegal. She sold property that legally belonged to you, without your knowledge or consent. We could pursue both criminal charges and civil recovery. I sat in stunned silence, processing the implications. Dad had known, somehow, he'd sensed that Mom might do exactly what she'd done, and he'd tried to protect both his legacy and me. There's more, Harrison continued. He also left detailed instructions about what to do if this situation arose. He was very specific about wanting to handle this with dignity. but also about ensuring justice was served. What kind of instructions? Harrison smiled, and for a moment I could see the young soldier who'd served alongside my father. He wanted the truth revealed in front of the family, so everyone would understand exactly what had happened and why it was wrong. He believed in accountability, but he also believed in giving people the chance to make things right. How would that work? We arrange a family meeting. I present the legal documents, explain what was stolen and what the consequences could be, and give your mother the opportunity to make full restitution before we pursue other remedies. The plan was both simple and brilliant. Harrison would come for dinner on Sunday evening. I'd tell Mom I wanted to introduce her to one of Dad's closest friends, someone who could share memories and help us all process our grief. Robert and Marcus would be there too, which was crucial. Mom had been able to hide her actions from me, but she'd have a much harder time explaining herself to her current husband and stepson. Sunday arrived with an unusual warmth for late autumn. I spent the morning preparing a roast, Dad's favorite meal, while my stomach churned with nervous energy. Mom seemed pleased that I was making an effort to connect with Dad's friends and maintain family relationships. "It's good that you're reaching out," she said, setting the table with her best dishes. "Your father would be happy to know we're honoring his friendships." The irony was almost unbearable. Harrison arrived precisely at 6, carrying a bottle of wine and a briefcase that I knew contained the documents that would change everything. He was gracious and charming, sharing funny stories about Dad's younger days, his terrible cooking attempts during National Guard training, and his unwavering loyalty to friends and family. Robert and Marcus warmed to him immediately. Robert, a quiet man who'd always seemed somewhat intimidated by Dad's larger-than-life personality, relaxed as Harrison included him in the conversation and treated him with genuine respect. Marcus, usually glued to his phone during family dinners, actually put his device aside and listened with fascination to stories about adventures and camaraderie. Mom beamed throughout dinner, clearly proud to be associated with such a distinguished gentleman who spoke so fondly of her late husband. She even pulled out photo albums, pointing out pictures of Dad and sharing her own memories of their courtship and early marriage years. It was almost heartbreaking to watch, knowing what was coming. After dessert, Harrison cleared his throat. "Linda, I hate to shift the mood, but there's actually a professional matter I need to discuss with the family. It concerns David's estate." Mom's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, I thought everything was settled." The lawyer who handled the will said everything was straightforward. The main will was indeed straightforward. But David created a separate document specifically concerning his personal collection. His stamps, books, and family heirlooms. He filed it with my office 6 months ago. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mom's face went pale, and I watched Robert's expression shift from curiosity to confusion to growing alarm as he began to understand the implications. Harrison opened his briefcase and withdrew the documents with the practiced calm of a man who'd delivered difficult news thousands of times. These items were specifically bequeathed to Isabel, with detailed documentation proving they were David's separate property, acquired before his marriage to Linda. "I don't understand," Robert said slowly. "What items?" "The vintage stamp collection, the first edition books, the pocket watch that belonged to David's father, several pieces of jewelry that had belonged to David's mother, and various other personal effects. Items that I understand were recently sold." Marcus looked confused. "Sold? What do you mean sold?" The silence stretched endlessly. Mom sat frozen, her face cycling through emotions: shock, fear, anger, and finally, a desperate attempt at defiance. "David never told me about any separate will. Those things were in our house, part of our shared property." Harrison's voice remained gentle but firm. "Linda, David kept receipts and documentation for every item dating back decades. He also has witnesses who can testify that he'd expressed his intention to pass these items to Isabel long before his illness. Most importantly, he specifically came to my office to ensure these wishes were legally protected." Robert turned to stare at his wife. "Linda, please tell me you didn't sell David's things without checking if Isabel wanted them." The desperation in Mom's eyes was painful to watch. "It was just old stuff. We needed money for practical things, for the family we have now." "What practical things?" Marcus asked, his voice small. The truth came spilling out in ugly, jagged pieces. The laptop, the clothes, the gaming equipment, the car repairs that had conveniently coincided with Robert's birthday. The vacation they'd been planning for next summer. Thousands of dollars spent on immediate gratification and material desires, while Dad lay dying, probably dreaming about the day he could show his grandson the pocket watch that had been passed down through 3 generations. Robert's face went through its own transformation: betrayal, humiliation, and a dawning understanding of what his wife had done not just to her stepdaughter, but to his own son's moral development. "You let Marcus accept gifts that were bought with stolen money." Robert's voice was barely above a whisper. "It wasn't stolen! I'm David's widow. I had every right." "You had no right," Harrison interrupted, his professional composure finally showing cracks of personal anger. "David trusted you to respect his wishes and protect his daughter's inheritance. Instead, you violated that trust in the most fundamental way possible." Marcus looked like he might be sick. "Mom, Linda, are you saying my laptop was bought with money from selling Isabel's dad's stuff?" The shame in that room was suffocating. I watched my mother, this woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me about honesty and integrity, who'd disciplined me, for taking $5 from her purse when I was 8, completely fall apart as the magnitude of her betrayal became clear to everyone she cared about. Harrison laid out the legal realities with methodical precision. Criminal charges for theft and fraud. Civil recovery for the full replacement value of irreplaceable items, plus damages. The destruction of her reputation and relationships. The impact on Robert's business and Marcus's college plans when the financial consequences hit home. But he also presented the alternative Dad had hoped for: full restitution, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and a commitment to making amends in whatever way possible. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of uncomfortable conversations, painful revelations, and slow steps towards something that might eventually resemble justice. Mom had to sell her car to begin paying restitution. Marcus voluntarily returned the laptop and most of the clothes, refusing to keep anything that had been purchased with what he now understood was stolen money. Robert began sleeping in the guest room and started mentioning marriage counseling with increasing frequency. Most surprisingly, Harrison was able to track down and recover several of the most important items. The stamp collection had been sold to a collector who understood its significance and agreed to sell it back at cost when he learned the circumstances. 2 of the first edition books were still on consignment at Miller's Antiques. The pocket watch had been purchased by a local businessman, who not only returned it without compensation, but insisted on paying for its restoration when he learned its family history. 3 months later, I sat in my new apartment, a small place closer to school, decorated with the recovered pieces of Dad's collection and a few new items that felt like natural extensions of his legacy. Harrison had become an unexpected friend, dropping by occasionally to share stories about Dad or to seek my opinion on young lawyers he was considering for his practice. The relationship with Mom would never be the same. We'd achieved a sort of civil distance, polite conversations about practical matters, but no real intimacy or trust. She'd moved forward with counseling, both individual and couples, and seemed to be making genuine efforts to understand why she'd made such devastating choices. But some betrayals create chasms that can't be fully bridged, only carefully navigated. Robert had surprised me by reaching out directly, expressing his humiliation about the situation and his commitment to making sure Marcus understood the consequences of dishonesty and selfishness. He'd also insisted on personally contributing to the restitution, even though he'd been an unwitting beneficiary rather than an active participant in the scheme. Marcus had perhaps been the most affected by the revelation. He'd written me a long letter apologizing not just for accepting the gifts, but for all the times he'd sensed that Mom was favoring him over me, and had enjoyed that favoritism instead of questioning it. He'd started volunteering at a local charity that helped families preserve items of sentimental value, and he'd begun learning about stamp collecting as a way to understand what had been lost and why it mattered. As I arranged Dad's restored pocket watch on my bookshelf next to his recovered first edition copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, I reflected on the lessons this experience had taught me. I'd learned that grief can reveal people's true character in ways that years of ordinary life never could. I'd learned that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about truth, acknowledgement, and the opportunity for people to choose who they want to be when faced with the consequences of their actions. Most importantly, I'd learned that the real inheritance Dad had left me wasn't the stamps or books or jewelry. It was the understanding that integrity isn't negotiable, that family bonds are built on trust and respect rather than blood and convenience, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses. I'd also learned that family doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Harrison Webb had become more of a father figure to me in 3 months than my stepfather had been in 3 years. The students I taught, hungry for guidance and authenticity, had become a source of purpose and connection that filled spaces in my heart I hadn't even known were empty. The evening light streaming through my apartment windows caught the face of Dad's pocket watch, making it gleam with the same warmth I remembered from childhood Sunday mornings, when he'd let me hold it and wind it carefully while he told me stories about my grandfather. I could almost hear his voice saying what he'd always said when life got complicated: Izzy, the truth might hurt for a while, but lies will hurt forever. I'd chosen truth, even when it was devastating. I'd chosen justice, even when it meant accepting that some relationships might never heal. I'd chosen to honor Dad's legacy not by clinging to bitterness, but by living according to the values he'd tried to teach me: integrity, compassion, and the courage to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. As I settled into my reading chair with a cup of tea and one of Dad's restored books, I realized that I wasn't just preserving his memory. I was continuing his story, carrying forward the best parts of who he'd been while building something entirely my own. I opened the book and began to read, surrounded by the treasures that had found their way home, and filled with gratitude for the father who had loved me enough to protect not just his possessions, but the principles that would guide me long after both of us were gone. Some legacies are about what you leave behind. The best ones are about what you inspire people to carry forward.